Alright, today I want to go through what many consider to be the most important concept in computer programming, the concept of arrays. And if you plan on doing any serious work in computer programming, think you want to be a game developer or anything, you have to understand this concept. And again, following what we did on methods, this technique is going to make your program more efficient. It's going to reduce the number of lines to code. And as you're going to see in the next couple of days on this topic, we're going to do programs that would have taken literally thousands of lines, and we're going to do it in 2 or 3 lines. So this concept's really important. Now the whole idea behind an array is, instead of having like A to represent one thing and B to represent another and C to represent another, what you do with arrays is you name a bunch of marks or a bunch of people's names, one thing, name. But then you use this square bracket to say name 1, name 2, name 3. And it's kind of a hard concept at the beginning to get the hang of, but once you do, you can make some very slick programs that take very little lines. Now, after you watch this video, if you still don't get it, I would recommend that you go through the video that's on our school hard drive right here. It's in video tutorials, and you just start it up and you can watch a program made from Microsoft.
In this video, we're going to talk about arrays.
Okay, now you'll do that later on, obviously, but that's in there and you can watch it. It's about a 15-minute video. Actually, all you need to do is watch maybe the first 10 minutes of it, and that'll give you a good idea of what we're going to cover with this new topic called arrays. Okay, now let's start off and let's take a look at a program that demonstrates a number of different ways to use arrays and how they're used in general. And it's just going to be basically some simple basic examples, okay, where we're going to deal with people's names and their marks. And we're going to do it in several different ways. And the first 2 ways, you'll basically get the direct answer in there. This new way here, we'll use an input box, and we'll enter a bunch of people's names. I'll just make up a few right here to show you what I'm going to be doing. And I'll just do one more. Okay, and it just redisplays the people's names and their marks. This other one uses a data file, which we covered briefly one day last week. Okay, it loads it in again. And this one here does basically what I just did a few seconds ago, except it also works out the person's average. Okay. So this is the kind of program we're going to do today, but the most important part is to say, let's take a look at the actual code and how it's done. So the most important thing when you do arrays at the very beginning, and this is the first technique that we're going to look at. This is the one you're probably not going to use. This is called assignment statements, but it gives you the basic idea. What you do when you use an array is you tell the computer ahead of time how many things you want to keep track of. You can't just start using them. You know how we used to say just string student name and integer student mark? Now you're going to use these square brackets. And what those square brackets do is tell you that you're using an array. Then you name whatever you want to call your variable, but it's going to be a bunch of things, not just one. Then you say this word new, you repeat the word string, and then in here you write down the number of things you have in your list. Now when you say 6, you actually only have 0 to 5. Okay, so but I don't like using 0. I like to start things at number 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you've got 5 things, you're going to have to always make this 1 more than what it is, because we're not going to use 0. I don't like using 0. Okay, so always make it 1 more than what it is. So if you had 10 people and their marks that you wanted to keep track of, you would make that bracket number 11 instead of 10. Now, what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is we're taking a person's name and we're putting it into that variable. Now before, we would have had to say, let Mary be maybe the variable M, and the mark be M1 or something, and then Jim could be J, and his mark could be M2. But those are regular variables. Now everybody's going to have the same name for their name and the same name for their mark, except they're going to have these brackets in there. So Mary will be student name 1, Jim will be student name 2. And you're almost there. This isn't saving lines. And you're right. when you put this stuff into the computer's brain, it still takes a bit of work. You know, if you've got a few people to type in, you got to put them in single file, just like I'm showing you. But after the information's in, and this is where the power of arrays comes in, all you do is use a for loop. So notice here I've got 5 people that I have to show people the results of. So I make a loop go from 1 to 5, and I go up by ones. And this is a little list box, and I'm putting information in it, and I'm going to take student square bracket I. Now hold it, what's I? Well, the first time it's going to be 1. So it'll take Mary and put her on the screen. Then I tab over a little bit and I put out student number 1's mark, which is 80. Okay, so let's say we had 500 of these people. Okay, it would still take 500 of these lines, or more, because it takes 2 lines per person. But then, after the information's in, this is still only 3 lines. Alright, so the power of the loop is going to let us get to each person in the array. Now that's the first way to do it, but to tell you the truth, this is a little bit inefficient. Like, this is good now, but this part is still inefficient. So let me show you the second technique. The second technique, you can basically use one line to feed in all the people. Well, that's kind of different, eh? So you can say string, there's a square bracket to mean an array, there's the name of the array, and then this is you filling in all the people's names. Now notice, I don't like using 0, so I don't put anything in there. And same with this one. I don't want to use the 0 mark or the 0 student. And then again, I have a loop that goes from 1 to 5, and you display all the results. Now the third and most important way is the way that you're going to see it on our next test. This is with what we call an input box, and that's the one you saw me do when I pressed this one right here. Okay, that's the one where it said, do you have any entries? And I said yes, and I type in a name, and then I type in a mark, and it shows me the person's name and the person's mark. Okay, now this one's a bit trickier, but again, it's the best way to do it with arrays, and it will reduce the size of the array. Now imagine, you're saying, well sir, this is pretty long. This program's pretty long too. Yeah, but this program would work for 10 million people. It would still be this size, no matter what. Whereas if you had 10 million people here, you would have to have 10 million lines. Okay, so this is a kind of a while true loop that we did before. Now notice up here, this time I don't really know how many people I have in my class. I could have 7 people, 8, I could have up to 99 people. Okay, and if you wanted to get even crazier, you could make it 1,000 or 1,000,000. Okay, but you have to tell the computer ahead of time how many total people, places, things, whatever you're going to keep track of, you have. So you leave room ahead of time for those 2 values, the student's name and the student's mark. Okay, this is important because what we're going to do as we ask a person, hey, what's your mark? You know, what's your name? We're going to keep track of it. Hey, that's the first person. That's the second person. That's the third person. All right, so now we start a loop, and we have a little do here that says, do you want to do this again? And of course, we're going to say yes the first time because we haven't done anything yet. Okay, when we say no, we're finished, we get out. All right, now, we're going to ask the person his name, and we'll store that temporarily here. And we're also going to ask him his mark, and we're going to store it temporarily here. Now the reason I do that is it's almost like I'm like a bouncer at a restaurant or a nightclub or something. I want to see if you're good. If you're not good, I'm not letting you in. So after I ask you for your name and mark, I check your mark. And your mark better be between 0 and 100. Because if it's like -7, you're being stupid and I don't want to let you in. If you're a good mark, I count you to say you're the first person. And now I take your name, which was temporarily in temp S, and I store it into student name square bracket counter. Well, counter was 0, and then I did this line right here, which makes it 1. So now your name, Mary, whatever, is student square bracket name 1. And your mark, whatever it is, let's say it was 90, is now student mark square bracket 1. So in the computer is being stored all these little numbers that represent your scores and your name. Okay, eventually you're done and you break, and then, like I said, every single kind of program after this is basically loops that go from 1 to, well, the other ones we did went to 1 to 9 or 1 to 5 or something, but now we try to make a good program that works for anything, so that's why we have this counter. The counter was counting. If we got to 17, great. Then this loop goes from 1 to 17, and it prints out whatever your mark is. Okay, this one I want to show you in kind of like super slow motion, just to give you an idea how this works. I'm going to press F11. Remember, that's what you do when you go in through what's called stepping. All right, we'll quickly go through it. Okay, we're almost done all these little buttons here, and we're going to get to the first part. Okay, so now we press the input box. Okay, so let me just stop that for a sec. Okay, so I would say, do you have any entries? Yes. Okay, keep pressing F11, and now we're going to ask the person their name. Press F11. I'm going to ask them their mark. Okay, now here's the important stuff. Was that a good mark? Well, 89 is between 0 and 100, so yes, it's a good mark. So the counter goes up by 1, so now there's a counter 1. And now I take CC, my name, and I'm going to put it into student name number 1. And I take 89 and put it into student mark number 1. Now, if I'm done, what I basically do now is I say, no, I don't want to do this again, and I press no. Okay, and then I would drop out of this loop, and I'm down at the bottom. And now I'm going to have a loop that goes from 1 to 1, because I only had one thing, right? If this would have been 20 things, I would have gone through the entire loop 20 times. Now there's 1, okay, and it's going to print out student number 1. See, there it is right there. And then student mark, there's the mark, 89. See how this array is shown to you as little squares? And there's tons of them, right? This goes all the way to 100, because I made it room for 100. And then it just shows you the results on the screen. Okay, and there it is. The fourth way to use an array is to use a data file. And I gave you a brief introduction to data files last week. Let me just show you. In the bin folder, I have a notepad file that I have stored people's names and marks. Notice how they're single file. And remember, there's always an enter after the last number so that you have a blank line. Okay, so this is a data file, and the way that you do a program that loads it in is this last example here. Basically, you tell the computer ahead of time that you still are up to 100 people can use your program. This part is where you make the computer point to your data file. Then you use this new command called streamreader, which loads in your data file. And this basically says, while we're not finished reading in the stuff, read in 2 things at a time, because I want to read in a person's name and their mark. Now, if the line that I read in is equal to nothing, or the second line is equal to nothing, then you're finished. Otherwise, count it, like I showed you last time, then take the line that you read in and store it into the person's name, and the other one that you read in, it's a string, so it has to be converted into a mark. All right, and that's the only difference. And then again, it's a loop that goes from 1 to the counter. So this is called a data file. The last example is a practical application. Okay, and that's more like what you're going to get on the test. After you read in all these things, what are you going to do with them? Well, you'd want to work out the average, maybe who got the highest mark and stuff like that. Now, basically, this is straightforward, like I just showed you before with the input boxes. You keep asking the person, do you want to do this, do you want to do this, do you want to do this? And then what you do is you work out the average. Now this last example shows you kind of a cool way to work out the average. It uses what's called a method. That's the stuff we learned before. Now look at, I say here display, okay, and then I pass down here the students' marks and their final average. Now if you want to, you can look at the example farther up. So display is up here. This is a method that displays a result. Okay, so there it is right there. It'll print out the results. Now the second part of that is to work out the average. So let me show you that. It's farther down. Here's the average routine. So this average routine, you're going to pass it the students' marks, and they're going to go right there in that array, and you're going to pass it the counter, and that's going to go in that variable. And then you have a loop that goes from 1 to the number of things in the array, and you basically add up all the marks. Okay, so if you don't like that line, that's like saying total equals total plus mark square bracket I, and it would cycle through all of them. Then at the end, you take the total and you divide it by the number of people that you used to work out your average.